Okay, hi everybody. In case you don't already know, I'm Peggy Cassidy. I'm the president of the New York Society for General Semantics, and tonight we are here to celebrate the release of Lance Strate's newest book, Not A, Not B, and C. This is the part that's like every flight you've ever taken where you get the talk from me that you've already heard, but I'm going to do it anyway, which is where I always encourage you to consider joining the Institute of General Semantics, which for, I always ask clients, $50, right, for the membership. You get a subscription to the quarterly journal, etc., which is edited by Thom, Gencarelli. You get to come to the Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture and Symposium, which is a 3-day event in the fall.
And dinner.
He always does that, and I was going to say, it's a 3-day event, and the first part of it is the lecture, which is preceded by a lovely dinner for you and a guest, and then 2 more days of talks and wonderful things, discounts in the bookstore, such as on a book like this, right? This is an IGS published book. Yes.
Oh,
is this the most recent IGS book?
Yeah. So far.
So far. So join us. The way this is going to work is that you're going to hear from both Lance and some of his longtime friends and colleagues. I'll just sort of stick around to help, I don't know, keep things organized. And as you can see, there are many copies here that you might want to go home with. So we'll make sure to leave time at the end for signing and such things. And normally I would have some bios printed out, and I didn't get a chance to do that yet. And I was going to read them off my phone, but my phone is the video camera. So I'm going to read these guys' bios off my laptop. Here we go. They have long bios, but you know, this is the short version. So, who do we have here with us today? Well, let's start with Lance. Lance Strate is Professor of Communication and Media Studies at Fordham University, President of the Institute of General Semantics, and one of the founders of the Media Ecology Association. He is the author of 11 books, including Media Ecology, An Approach to Understanding the Human Condition, and Concerning Communication, Epic Quests and Lyrical Excursions Within the Human Life World. He has published 3 books of poetry, the most recent being First Letter of My Alphabet. Some of you were probably at the launch for that book a year or 2 ago?
Last December.
Last December, 2 Decembers ago.
Yeah.
On the other side of the room.
Exactly, we're over there. In case you're confused, it was just, we were turned around.
For the piano.
Right. Find it on YouTube if you weren't here. Thom Gencarelli is professor and founding chair of the former communication department at the former Manhattan College, now Manhattan University in Riverdale, New York. He is editor of the IGS Journal, etc., a review of general semantics, as well as past president of the Media Ecology Association, the New York State Communication Association, and the New Jersey Communication Association twice. He is co-editor with Brian Cogan of Baby Boomers and Popular Culture, an inquiry into America's most powerful generation, and he has 2 books due out this year. He'll be in this seat pretty soon. But they are Searching for the Right Notes, Essays on Media, Music, and Meaning with Peter Lang, and with Corey Anton, General Semantics and Politics, also through IGS, right?
That's the next one.
That's the next one. Paul Levinson, let me not block the view, is professor at Fordham with Lance. His science fiction novels include The Silk Code, The Consciousness Plague, The Pixel Eye, Borrowed Tides, The Plot to Save Socrates, Unburning Alexandria, Chronica, and It's Real Life. His novelette, The Chronology Protection Case, was made into a short film and is on Amazon Prime Video. His novelette, Robinson Calculator, was published in the Robots Through the Ages anthology in July 2023. He was president of the Science Fiction Writers of America, 1998 to 2001. His nonfiction books, including The Soft Edge, Digital McLuhan, and New Media, have been translated into 15 languages. And let me just say one thing I forgot to say, which is that I should point out that our secretary of the New York Society of General Semantics is Lance. Our treasurer is Thom, and Michelle Schott is also here. She's on the NYSGS board. Oh, and so is Terry McLuhan. Where are you?
Right here?
Yes, there you are in your usual spot. Hello.
What do you want me to do?
Nothing, just acknowledge your presence. So, what we're gonna do is have maybe Paul speak a little first, and then Thom, and then we will hear from Lance, and we'll kind of take it from there. So,
Well,
take it
let me say, first of all, I've read Lance's latest book. I think it's a marvelous book. It's a great mixture of very serious issues, but a lot of humor in there as well. And what I hope Lance can talk to us about, at least a little, and this is pretty obvious, but I think it's extremely important. Apropos of the last book you mentioned of mine, It's Real Life, which is an alternate history of the Beatles book. As a writer, I've always loved alternate history, but I never dreamed that someday I would be living in one right now. And I think it's a pretty dangerous alternate history at that. One of the themes of Lance's book, because it's dealing with general semantics and Korzybski, is how we can both understand the world we're living in better, and how we can, maybe even more importantly, make it a better world. So I hope Lance can talk a little bit about how some of the insights in his book can be applied right now by thinking people to combat this dangerous situation that we're all in.
If I did that, why would they buy the book?
Don't tell them everything.
Okay.
Thom?
Oh,
You wanna?
okay. Actually, if I grab it without falling from my chair again, I actually wrote something as Lance and Paul. I am a student of Neil Postman, and I came with a script. And I wanted to do something for this occasion, and the occasion of the release of Lance's book. Lance and I have been colleagues and worked together for longer than I should admit for either one of us. It's been a long and prosperous run. So why do people write books? I can think of 4 simple, clear, and obvious reasons. And I'd like to offer them to you, even though I'm not quite sure that I'm ordering them in any appropriate or hierarchical way. The first is that we write books so that people will read them. Given the Barthian distinction between the work and the text, nobody writes a book so that it will sit on a shelf or in some publishing company's warehouse or as an electronic file somewhere or as a part of a pile on someone's desk or night table. We want the text. We want, at least with respect to the kinds of writing and books that we typically launch and talk about at these events, we want tens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of people to read our books across time and space, to make meaning of them, to learn from them, to contest the ideas in our great and ongoing conversation. I kind of think of it in these terms, and I'll say 2 things. One, it's kind of like, you know, when I was in kindergarten and I brought home that finger painting from class, and my mother hung it up on the refrigerator door and said, "Oh, that's so beautiful." And then the whole family saw it, you know, and then the guests saw it, right? But I also think back to traveling with Casey Lum, who's another colleague of ours, to Taiwan a few years back, where we met Tom Cruise while he was doing press for one of the Mission Impossible movies, but we walked into the bookstore at National Taiwan University in Taipei, Taida, it was what they call it, and we saw the Chinese translation of Paul Levinson's Digital McLuhan displayed right on the post as you walked in the door of the bookstore.
It's a great cover.
Right? The second reason that people write books is because we want to leave our mark in the world. We want to leave something behind, to leave more than just a memory for those people who know us, and which is really only going to last for a few generations after we're gone. We want to leave a record of both our existence that will cross time and space into the future, but also a contribution that speaks to a life well lived and to work well done. We want to time bind our way into a world that we will never know, with works that will stand as our attempt to assist in the very project of this languaging human species as we try to improve our lot and save ourselves and our children and their children, etc., and solve our problems and help one another. Or for those who write fiction and poetry, and Lance writes poetry, right? To leave behind artifacts of exquisite beauty and artistry and that speak to human aspiration and achievement. In other words, we hope we will matter as much as our work. We want, if I can say it, immortality. The third reason that people write books, like the one we're here to talk about tonight, is that we want to move forward the learning and knowledge in our field, our discipline. And here then, I need to say it, that Lance is our foremost figure in moving the overlapping thought systems of general semantics and media ecology, or in Neil Postman's famous phrase, general semantics writ large, into the 21st century. And again, with respect to the kinds of books that we launch and talk about here, we commit to disciplines because within our own epistemic set of learning and knowledge and values and beliefs, they don't speak to some special interest or field of expertise because we have to have one. They speak to what we believe is most important, most essential to human life as we move forward from the past through these ephemeral moments and into the future. To call upon Lance's own words from the title of another one of his books that Peggy mentioned, the overlapping thought systems of general semantics and media ecology speak to the nature of our human condition, our human endeavor, human experience. They're about what makes and defines us as human and the species that has come to usurp domination over this tiny little speck of space dust that's hurtling through an infinite space. In fact, maybe I should say that they're not about the nature of the human condition, but directly address and define the human condition itself. The fourth and final reason that people write books is that we want to make a difference. In GS terms, and we want to make the difference that makes a difference. We want to present ideas thinking through and enabled by our language that matter and that will have real and lasting and demonstrable, verifiable consequence. It is never just some intellectual exercise. It is never, for those of us who are academics, about the fact that we have to publish, that we need to do this as a way to justify our status and our stature. And in both GS and media ecology, this is exactly what Lance has always endeavored to do, to make a difference. Of course, in general semantics, it's been an interesting endeavor because of what I might refer to as the schism. What I mean by this is that the history of general semantics as a thought system begins with the received wisdom from the founder, Alfred Korzybski. And as applied epistemology, the beginnings of the field, if I can call it that, was a matter of adherence to and believers in the field adopting and adapting and applying what Korzybski conjured forth for us as ways to live, as ways to reconceive and shape our intrapersonal and interpersonal communication towards some semblance of sanity, of sane thinking and action in our mutual and collective coexistence of what are now over 8 billion people living on the planet. But to many of these adherents and practitioners, that's it. The Bible has been written, and what a tome it is, right? Now go forth and proselytize and teach and help the uninitiated, to, we hope, the benefit of us all. But of course, there is etc. Which is to say that not only does the thought system teach us that we can never completely know anything outside of knowing with certainty certain things within the physical and biological sciences, that we can never completely know anything about what it is that we humans have devised, which includes everything under the banner of what we refer to as the social sciences. No, there's a kind of irony here that even Korzybski's work and thinking is unfinished, that there is and that there must be an etc., an ampersand C. This is a huge chunk of what Lance's work is and has long been about. In a kind of Talmudic tradition and approach, GS work is unfinished. And Lance continues it and honors it by having learned everything that he can on the shoulders of the giants. Korzybski himself, but also S.I. Hayakawa, Wendell Johnson, Gregory Bateson, and others in the GS tradition whose names do not appear in the bibliography of this book, like Samuel Bois, Stuart Chase, Irving Lee, Robert Pula, Anatole Rappaport, and others. And of course, and to be clear that these are just names in the GS tradition, were I to add media ecology, or the ME canon, the list would be quite a bit longer and more extravagant, like it is in this book's bibliography. But let me be now just a little bit more specific. One of the things I hope we'll go on to talk about tonight is Lance's process, his writing process. Because I read something like the chapters, if not A, then E, and the end, and I'm left kind of astounded. I'm astounded by the question of how he figures all out something like these arguments, these thought constructions, these puzzles. I'm astounded as always by his total command and recall of everything he has ever read. And okay, maybe I'm a little envious, jealous of the fact that his brain works like this while mine, not so much. It may come across as rather dismissive sounding to say it, but I've always been captivated by the fact that he is clever. And to immediately atone for that, let me say it a different way. Lance is not only a student of language, he has become a master of it. He seems to revel in the play and the discovery that comes with being immersed in and enamored with a world of words. This also speaks to the fact that he's a poet who has now published, as Peggy said, 3 books of poetry. But to me, this poesy comes across in everything he writes. To wit, let me quote a little bit from the end. And I quote, "The English translations of the Torah and Hebrew prayers that I encountered in my youth followed the King James and Douay versions, and were altogether memorable, so much so that they came to inform my own cadence, diction, and voice as a writer. This accounts for my affinity for using conjunctions to lead off sentences. And I would suggest that we focus too much on providing variety of expression in our prose in contemporary culture, and not enough on the poetic form of language, and certainly not enough on the importance of memory and recall." The other thing I hope we'll go on to talk about is GS and ME here in the 21st century, what Lance's hopes are for teaching and learning and encouraging the movement of these movements forward, and how he regards his role in helping along this project, which accounts for why we all in this room are gathered together here tonight. In the end, though, I have just one little nit to pick. As some of you well know, in addition to doing this kind of work, I've been a songwriter for all of my adult life. And Lance and I, without having any idea whatsoever what the other was doing, but somehow on the same wavelength, have been stealing from one another. Lance presented the chapter that ends this book, The End, at the Spring 2023 online symposium sponsored by the Institute of General Semantics. And I was at just around the same time writing a song that came out on the album that my ensemble Blue Race just released at the end of this past August, a song entitled The End of the World. Same end, A and D. In the meantime, at the same time, Lance released his 3rd book of poetry in this room, right? The first letter of my the first letter of my alphabet, which was launched here, and just as I was finishing a song entitled it begins with A. Coincidence? Coincidence? Well, maybe we've just been hanging around together and working too closely together for too long a time. But I have, without a doubt, long respected and learned from and been influenced by Lance and his work. I am therefore greatly pleased and honored to be up here tonight to celebrate the launch of this important book, Lance's latest in a pantheon of great, significant, influential, and hopefully continually impactful works in the overlapping project that is general semantics and media ecology, as well as in what Lance himself, as a unique individual thinker and writer, has to offer us.
So having set the stage some, obviously we wanted to hear from Lance. Do you want to, could you start by just telling us a little bit about where this book came from and what you wanted to do with it?
I don't know. I thought we could maybe end right there. I think, you definitely want to see that in et cetera, right? Where it came from, you know, where do babies come from, and
Well, I mean, this is book number what?
11.
12?
11.
So, you know,
well, it depends.
so why did you need to write another one? What wasn't done?
I don't know. Just seems the thing to do, but you know, there's a lot of material that I've worked on over the years, and I'm trying to think of ways to put it together, because, you know, you publish, say, a piece in some obscure journal, and nobody, you know, a few people read it, and then it's all
Not your
forgotten.
journal, that.
Well,
He
no.
didn't mean etc.
Yeah, no, but I mean, yeah, I mean, just any journal, you know, I mean, Peggy's the editor of Explorations in Media Ecology, you know, but you know, and also things that don't quite get published, or things that wind up online, but then the website's gone, you know, there's a lot of that, but also, you know, I think those of us from of a certain age come from a time when publishing books was the thing to do. It really isn't so much anymore, but, you know, we still live in the past. You know, as Marshall McLuhan put it, we're looking through the rearview mirror. But also, and I should say about our publishing program with the Institute of General Semantics, that you know, it is part of what the Institute is about, which is to promote learning and understanding and thinking along these lines. And those of us that do publish with the IGS do not get any royalties. They are something that we basically give as a donation to the Institute, so that any profit from them goes directly into the Institute. So, you know, partly it is also putting in that labor as a way to support the Institute for those of us who are not like millionaires and can leave money behind for that purpose. And then I kind of look through material and try to group them together in ways that I think make sense. And that's what I did in this case. So I basically came up with 6 pieces. One, as you mentioned, the If Not A, Then E was never published. It was presented in various forms as talks with PowerPoints and so forth, but never had a published version. And so it's always been on the back burner that I need to create a published version of this at some point. Let me try to remember, because I changed some of the titles. Word Image Number was based on someone I knew had asked me, and who had actually a kind of visual design company, and as part of their website they had a blog, and he said, you know, will you write some pieces for us? You know, he was interested in what I'd written about the difference between images and words, which is very fundamental for us. And would you write some pieces? So I wrote a few kind of pieces for the blog, and then for various reasons, we never got a chance to finish it off, to complete what I was going to say. So for the book, I went back, edited those pieces, and added the extra pieces that were missing. Then It Is What It Isn't appeared as an etc. article, and go back and revise them. But it was very much, that started with folks who know general semantics know that we're part of the tradition, actually one that goes back to antiquity, of finding the word is and the verb to be highly problematic, and one that kind of messes up our thinking. And with that in mind, when people started to say it is what it is, that is like fundamentally infuriating to hear people say that. Even though I have to admit that I myself have been guilty of doing that, but that's what motivated me to write this piece, which is the longest piece in the book, and provides I wouldn't say a complete summary of general semantics, but hits on many topics that have to do with general semantics, because it is such a central point. And then there was a piece on imagination that I was asked to do. A fellow was doing an online magazine on imagination and was asking people to write for it. Some famous people wrote pieces. I think you did, actually, didn't you, Paul?
I'm definitely a famous person.
Yeah.
I don't know if I wrote anything.
But and I actually wound up writing a bit longer than he wanted, but and I think it's gone. I think that
Yeah, I remember that. It was
Yeah.
some guy we met on Twitter or something.
yeah, or Facebook or one of those places. Yeah, and it appears as a magazine. I think he did like a second issue and then got frustrated that not enough people were looking at it, and it's gone.
We put him out of business.
Yeah. So I included that, which is the most poetic piece, I would say, in it. And then there was a piece I was asked to do a keynote for a conference that was held in Atlantic City that about 8 people came to. That was about new media, and it's called "So You Want to Change the World: A Hitchhiker's Guide to Subversive Thinking," which also is published in the journal Anakant, which is the general semantics journal that is published in India by the Balvank Parekh Center for General Semantics and Other Human Sciences. And that fit in well, especially with the If Not A piece, which, these pieces cover media ecology in the context of general semantics. And the final piece, as Thom was talking about, the A&D, which goes into the extensional devices that Korzybski suggested, and suggests a further one similar to etc., but gets into starting sentences with the word and. Along the way, particularly orality literacy studies becomes very significant for a lot of these kinds of questions. But then when you do a book, I was talking to Thom about this as well. Our dear departed mentor, Gary Gumpert, some of you know who he was, and I did my first book, which was an edited collection through a book series that Gary was the editor of. It was called Communication and Cyberspace, the book. Peggy has a piece in that. I think you do too.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was first doing this, he said, you need, to have a strong introduction. That otherwise it's just a collection of stuff. It's the introduction that makes it a book. And so, and that's true for edited anthologies, but I also took this approach in other kinds of collections like this. And so I wrote an introduction that, I thought was, brought some substance into it, and particularly addressed the concept of negation, negativity, which is both in the title, which, by the way, the title can be read in two ways. It's not A, not B, and I think it naturally is and C, but that abbreviation actually means etc. So you could read it as not A, not B, etc. As well. So I included that. This book also has, I decided to be more, it's not quite the medium as the massage, but I wanted to have more color. It has a lot of color and illustrations that were included. And then just for fun, I said, okay, I'm going to put the bibliography and the index after the introduction rather than at the end. And what I explain is that when I look to see if a book is worthwhile for me or not, about the first thing I do is look at the index and the references, and that'll tell me a lot about whether this book is something that I might be interested in. Like, are people that I like being mentioned? Are there topics? Do they mention, Marshall McLuhan? Is Korzybski in there? Is Bateson in there? Do they mention media ecology or general semantics in the index?
Mention me.
Yeah, not so much, but yes.
I just mean the word.
You're in the
me.
bibliography.
Yeah. No, I look for you too, and other friends as well. So I thought, for once, let me put these things. It's not
They're
quite
not
at the
supposed to be.
not quite at the beginning, but towards the beginning. They come up with the index comes up on page 25, and then the references on 35. And it also taught me, especially about the index, why you don't do that, why it's a dumb idea to do that. But at least this time, for something different, I thought, why not?
Wait, why was it a dumb idea to do that?
Well, because you're looking for page numbers, and it just becomes kind of strange to have page numbers early in the book completely missing from the index, because you don't index the index. Although I guess maybe you should, as being self-reflexive. The first book I published, my first authored book, which was on media ecology, was called Echoes and Reflections. And I put in the index media ecology, and then I put the entirety of the book. But the publisher took that one out.
I wouldn't have taken it out if I was the publisher. Let me, by the way, ask you two questions. One a new question, the other an old question that you've already heard. Let's go with the new question. So, I know you say in the book, and you just said it again, that the phrase "it is what it is" irritates you. And apparently general semantics doesn't like it either. Not that a field could like or not like something, but you get what I'm saying.
General semanticists.
That's right. But it seems to me it's pretty clear what that means, and it's somewhat useful. In other words, you say something is what it is when there's really no point in further describing it, even discussing it. It's there, it is. You're looking at it, you're talking about it, you're considering it, and you sort of end that discussion, that session, by saying, all right, look, it is what it is.
It's a repudiation of language and a suggestion of direct experience that certain things were just obvious.
Yeah.
Excuse me, sir, we haven't invited the audience
Yeah,
to
Shut up, Paul.
Troublemaker. No, but you're right. So, tell me why it's so irritating to have somebody say,
It's a
well,
little
look,
too much like A is
this
over
is
A.
what it is. In your case, this is a very useful book. There's no point in discussing it any further. No, I wouldn't say that about your book, but we could say that about many things. For example, it's difficult to find parking in a certain part of the city. Why is that the case? And you can discuss it for like 20 years, but a more useful thing to do after maybe 10 seconds is, look, it is what it is. This is parking in a big city like
By the way,
this.
I always pretend like
Yes.
when I come here, right, that I really want to go to Alphabet Land, and you know, I'm not going to find a space over there, so I'm going to come here.
That's right. So that's the first question. The second
rest is
question,
silence.
so I'll give you both, and you can even tie them together. I actually interviewed Lance a week or two ago, and there's a video of it and a podcast. One of the things that we discussed is another point that Lance makes in his book, that there is no such thing as two things being the same. Everything is the same. And and I said, well, okay, look, if you have two newly minted pennies, aren't they exactly the same? And Lance correctly said, well, no, the molecules in one are not the molecules in the other. So here's now my additional annoying question. What you said is true, but I maintain that's extremely trivial. Because in terms of we human beings, these two pennies are the same. They're worth the same, they look the same, they have the same weight. It doesn't matter that they're different molecules.
And we're not going to make them anymore.
That's true too. That's an example of a broken clock being right twice. So the president who said that we should do away with pennies, he was right about that. I want to give him credit. He was also right that I really resented the fact that I was charged $9 just to drive. The admission here was free, but thanks to the governor of New York State, we have to pay $9. So let Trump be a dictator insofar as he can dictate to the governor of New York. You can't do that. Give Levinson back his money.
Well, I tell you, as a commuter coming in from New Jersey, traffic has been much better since this since this has been imposed, and so I'm actually, I don't have as much of a problem with it, but okay, on is, I mean, you're right that the phrase "it is what it is" is sort of, and I actually opened with William Safire. Had done a piece on it. And he was the language maven for the New York Times for a long time about what that phrase means. How it's being used. And then there's also a Jerry Seinfeld monologue. Where he's saying, I'll just read. This is from Seinfeld. That human beings like to be close together because it makes it easier for us to judge and criticize the personalities and activities of these humans. We like to give our thoughts, our comments, our opinions. Sometimes we run out of opinions. We make them up. It is what it is a very popular opinion statement nowadays. I'm sure some idiot said it to you today. You can't get through a day without somebody going, well, it is what it is. Why are you alive? To just say air words that fill the room with meaningless sounds? I'd rather somebody blew clear air into my face than said, it is what it is to me one more time. Just come up to me and go, because I get the same data from that. People like to say those things. It is what it is. You see, if you repeat a word twice in a sentence, you can say that with a lot of confidence. Business is business. Rules are rules. Deal's a deal. When we go in there, as long as we know what's what and who's who, whatever happens, happens, and it is what it is.
He's right.
Right? But what Alfred Korzybski said, and is not as well known as the map is not the territory, but he said, whatever you say a thing is, it is not. Right? And it is the argument, and unlike some people who followed him, he didn't object to all of the uses of the verb is, but particularly the use of the verb is in terms of identity, right? So when we say, and I use the examples in the piece, if you want to say Donald is a criminal, and we get a lot of pleasure in saying that, let's be honest here, but it's not right because it draws this equal sign in our heads to say that everything about Donald is criminal, which includes getting rid of pennies, right? And everything about criminality applies to Donald. And, and that is the problem that, and it's one that has been referred to long before Korzybski. And as I mentioned, it goes back to actually antiquity, but that it informs our thinking. I remember our old professor, all of us here, Neil Postman, once used the example. He talked about how a student was just saying, I'm feeling this, I'm just a B student, right? And it's like, I am a B student, like that's what I am, rather than understanding that, I took courses and I didn't get, I got okay grades, but maybe I can do better. Or, I remember him mentioning an example where somebody who was applying as a student was denied, and the administrators were saying, well, this person is a C student. And this was somebody who was applying like 20 years after they graduated, and, which is also things change, world is dynamic. So it's largely the identity. There's also the predication when you say like someone is bad, and people in dealing with children learned about this. This is like old hat now. You don't say to a little child, you're bad, because it's like you take that on as equal, as equaling what I am. And so better to say you did a bad thing. It also means that you can. It's about your action, and you should change your action. But even better to say, what you did made me sad. That's what we use. I'm sad about this. But it's to then put it on me, right? That it's how it affected me rather than something about you. And that's really where we're coming down to. But there were people, and that piece, I get into it, because after Korzybski, so Korzybski's like, let's be careful about using the verb to be in these ways. But there were this group of people in general semantics who took it to an extreme, and they came up with this idea, E prime, meaning English prime, which is English where you completely eliminate the verb to be. It's extreme, although it's an interesting exercise to do. I wrote one piece, and it was actually when Neil died, when Neil Postman died, and I don't know, it was just I guess it was part of grieving for me that, I was asked to write the piece for etc., and I wrote the piece entirely in E prime. I don't know why, it just was just a way to channel that emotion, except for quotes. I didn't take it out of quotes because that would be inappropriate. But it was awful. It's just so hard to do. But it's an interesting exercise, and it does improve your writing. Because what's boring, is to say, it is raining, right? And you say, the rain poured down, and get into that, it makes you a better writer. But in any event, it is, and this connects to the other point of identity, that, and that is perhaps the fundamental idea in general semantics, leading everything off, non-identity, because in reality, according to science, there are no identity relationships. Nothing is absolutely identical to anything else. So if you want to say that one person is just like another, right? One general semanticist is just like another. I'm going to avoid the ethnic and other kinds of touchy things, but one media ecologist is just like another. One Fordham faculty member is just like another. Yeah.
That's not true.
Exactly, right? And that's the the problem with stereotyping, right? That we say, you're all alike. And that's when you say, don't treat me like a member of a group, treat me like an individual, because everyone is different. So you're right that it's trivial when it comes to pennies, because all we care about are the intrinsic value. It might make a difference if you're melting them down and you got some of those steel pennies from the World War II era, then it does make a difference. But if you're weighing them, depending on how sensitive your scale is, no two pennies will weigh alike. you know, so again, scientifically, but it also, non-identity is also the single penny, because that single penny is constantly changing. And that goes back to, you know, what we learned in the 20th century according to physics, is that, you know, there are subatomic particles flying off and others joining in. And everything is constantly in flux. And the problem is that our way of perceiving and then talking about the world suggests that things aren't changing, that things are permanent and stable, and we need that for sanity, and we need that for certain operations. But when we get into problems, it's often because we're not taking into consideration the fact that things are changing. Those of you that are interested in art, you know, I'm going back to the early 20th century, the idea that everything's in flux, everything's a process. That modern art movement was really founded on this idea that reality is dynamic, and that informed the artwork for the elite few who are dealing with it, and James Joyce and literature and so forth. But what Korzybski was trying to do is to get us to adjust our thinking to better take into account these things. So
Okay. I get that, but just a couple of things. First of all, you're using bad examples of the application of something, and you're using that to condemn that whole process. So obviously it's wrong to say to a child, you are bad, are being obviously a kind of is, because that is hurtful to someone who's too young to basically understand they're not completely bad. So you don't say that to a little kid. But it's 100% appropriate. If I was, let's again stay with Donald Trump, if I was standing, you know, across from him in a room, I would have no problem saying you are bad. And here's the other point, which sort of relates to this penny issue. For the most part, it's true. For the most part, Donald Trump is a very bad person and a very bad president. And I don't see what damage that's done to either reality or ethics to make that statement. Let me just say one other thing about this elimination of things. This has been something that not only Korzybski's followers, but all kinds of people in all kinds of walks of life have been calling for in all kinds of surprising ways. There was a science fiction writer who, I don't know what his real name was, but his nom de plume was Damon Knight. And some of you may remember a Twilight Zone story, To Serve Mankind. I highly recommend it. And that was based on Damon Knight's story. And one of the things that Damon Knight was known for, he once wrote a little essay called Apostrophe Delenda Est. And that Delenda Est comes from the Latin Carthage delenda est, meaning Carthage must be destroyed. So this was Damon Knight's way of saying, what do we need apostrophes for? People can understand it. It's so confusing, it's versus it's. Yeah, he had a good point there, right? Because you can't use the apostrophe as the possessive in the word its, because then it confuses you between the possessive and the contraction. But again, that's one bad example. And Damon Knight, based on that and who knows what else, called for the elimination of the apostrophe, and we're still using it today as much as when he first called for it in the 1950s. So I think all of these situations that we're talking about, your specific examples are correct, but you go to a generalization which I think is not correct.
well, you use one bad example, which is a bad example, right? Because the other examples I gave, and they were just off the top of my head, was the student who says, I'm just a B student, right? That's someone who is a young adult, or I believe it was a fellow who had graduated 20 years ago, and the administrators are saying he is a C student, right? And that is where a lot of our thinking goes astray. And that's the thing. It may not create a problem for you to say that Donald Trump is a bad person, and it doesn't create a problem for me either. but there are a lot of situations where these kinds of statements do create problems, and that, in general, the idea is to be more thoughtful and reflective in our thinking, and that is where prejudice comes in. That's where stereotyping comes in, and that's where a lot of difficulties come in. And on the other hand, when we're looking for creative problem solving or just being creative, the idea of non-identity becomes very powerful. It's another example, and this is extensional devices. I think Wendell Johnson came up with this, but rather than, when you say what is the cause of war, right? We're implying that all wars are the same and they all have a singular cause. And his extensional device was to turn it into plurals and ask, and it doesn't have a poetic sound to it, but what are the causes of wars? Or what are, talk about fallings and loves. I know that sounds horrible, but to understand that it's not a singular unitary kind of thing, but that when actually we look at it, and in fact, in dealing with any kind of intellectual question, I find it's generally actually very productive to say, well, let's not think of it as one thing, let's break it down into many different types of things and try to understand those differences that make a difference, of course, but that is essential to going beyond kind of everyday thinking where people are constantly falling into traps. And that's where Korzybski started again, is that people are unhappy. People are frustrated. Wendell Johnson's, right, IFD disease. We idealize, that leads to frustration and demoralization. And we need to get out of those traps, and that this is part of the pathway to getting out of that and towards, right? And that's why Korzybski's book, Science and Sanity, right? Because people are not necessarily insane, but are unsane. That was the term he used for, that we don't have this, we're not fully rational, and that we're led astray in a lot of ways.
But that's indeed the cause of war. And there is a general cause of war, and you can put it in a lot of different ways. One way that I often think about it is we're not descended from bonobo monkeys. Bonobo monkeys are primates in which the females are in charge. They make love, not war, and basically they're non-violent. They don't fight. In contrast to other great apes like chimpanzees and gorillas, which unfortunately are very much like us. They fight, they get into arguments, they kill each other, they're very jealous of their territory and so on. So if someone asks, well, what's the cause of war? I think you're right in terms of what's the cause of this war versus that war.
This is why Hitler invaded Poland, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Right. Because we're not bonobos. Come on. That's silly. Or why we had the American Revolution, right? Because we're a different kind of ape. I mean.
Well, because there are peaceful ways to settle things.
Yeah. But you wanted to say something.
Well, talking about is and the verb to be, I'm surprised we haven't used the book as an example, right? So, this is Lance's book, right? Now, all of us here have read it. Lance has read it a number of times because he actually wrote it and reread it and revised it and revisited, pieces that he wrote a long time ago. I read, I was there for the original presentation of If Not A, Then E, and published the end and published Figments of a Fragment and etc. So I read them for a second time. Now we're here with a pile of books because we're hoping that you folks will, be interested to not just buy a book, but you'll buy a book because you'll actually read it, but you haven't read it yet. And so you don't know what's in here except to the extent that we've talked about it. So what is this book? Well, this book, again, isn't anything until you open it up and start to read it and you make meaning out of it, but each one of you will make meaning out of it in different ways than the four of us did or any one of the individuals up here did. And so, what is this thing?
It's a great point, Tom, and to that, I won't say that necessarily you'll read it many times, but any book that you read more than once is a different book the second time and you read it, and the third time you read it. Perhaps understanding media, for example, especially, is always different. You can keep reading that, and you always find something different in that.
You discussed, though, in your book, you say that you don't fully embrace relativism. So, if I say this is right, you don't want to acknowledge that something can be completely right, that it could also be wrong. That's a pretty profound kind of relativism, because the way I think
say that.
What did you say? Okay, so you think it's always wrong to say this is right, using the word is, because everything is never completely right? Is that what your point is on that ethical issue? Or is it okay to say this is right? Okay, to give me this is right, thou shalt not kill. Just as a general statement, is it wrong to use is in that category?
Where is? It's shall not.
Yeah, because here's the point.
Wait, where is in that statement? What's the is?
Is. This is right.
To say.
Oh,
okay.
To say thou shalt not kill?
Yes.
That's wrong.
Okay.
Oh my God.
Well, it is. It is actually incorrect because it's a poor translation of the original, which the better translation, because if you really follow that, then you couldn't eat, because anything you eat you have to kill, including plants.
You can eat leaves of plants and they'll be fine.
Well, but the correct translation is you should not murder. It's a very different kind of statement. Murder is a special category, and it does allow.
Okay, so what about that then?
Well, what's the statement?
Murder is wrong.
That's an ethical principle.
So is the word is a problem in that?
Well, it can be depending on the context. First of all, everything in language is context dependent. So, if you want to say murder is wrong, well, what's the specific context for saying that? And
Well, I don't believe in capital punishment as an example, so that would be the context.
right,
I just unpacked.
so there we
that.
get into it,
No, right.
kind of debate, and
Right.
and the problem there is that what do we mean by wrong? What do we mean by murder?
Right.
Which is also something that is subject to a legal definition.
Right, but nonetheless, I can't think of any specific real examples in which you could say murder is wrong, is not a correct ethical statement.
On your way home,
Go ahead.
on your way home tonight, someone comes at you with a knife.
Right,
There just happens to be a shovel on the ground.
right,
You pick up, big shovel. You pick up that shovel and you crack him in the head. It doesn't stop him. He keeps coming. You crack him again. You're trying to not be killed yourself.
right,
And you crack him one last time and kill him.
right. Well, that's a pretty easy point. Ideally, what you want to do is disable the person, render the person unconscious so he can't hurt you with the knife.
Didn't work.
But you don't need to murder the
work.
person for that to happen.
Well, and is that murder, right?
Yeah, that's also,
necessarily.
See, the thing is that you could better put it, and that's we don't want to
Context.
go crazy with this. And again, I don't advocate e-crime, but you could say that according to many ethical systems, murder is considered a sin. According to many legal systems, murder is considered illegal. Now I'm using the verb is there as a helper, which is one of the ways, at least for Korzybski, that's okay, right? Because that's not the is of identity to say it is considered, right? But it's a way to better contextualize it than just this flat out statement. And again, I have no problem with the statement at all, but we bring this up, and this particularly bring this to bear when we're facing problems, when we're facing difficulties and trying to understand what the problem is. That's where our language can lead us astray. So I'm not for a fanatical version of this, but I want to kind of understand it, and I think that when you're forced to not make statements like that, when you kind of bring in that discipline, then you get a more precise kind of statement, a more precise form of expression.
I also think, again, it comes down to the idea of when do we know that we are right? And right in a certain way, right in a complete way. Do we question ourselves and question the extent to which we think we know something? And what does it mean to really know it, right? That's, I think, the kind of elasticity in this thinking that's important.
Okay. By the way, just to clarify, the main reason why I started this discussion is when you use a book or any work of art as an example of why it's wrong to identify something so precisely, you're really loading the question beforehand for the answer, because of course one of the things about books is that they're subject to multiple interpretations. By the way, was that a correct
and you're trying to have the
use?
last word too, right?
Yeah, but that's true of all reality.
Yeah.
In reality, the world is subject to multiple interpretations. So,
And of course, if you're hyper
Which is
conscious
what-
of this, would you ever finish a book, right? Would you ever say, "Oh, I'm done because I've said the last word. I've said it the best I can."
I
Peggy,
feel like
you're in
we
charge.
have people
Yes,
wanting
they're
to ask you
bursting at the
questions,
seams.
so yeah, I know, it feels like time.
I haven't seen Ed in about 15 years. back
Okay,
there.
so go ahead.
Okay.
Oh wait, let's do this, sorry,
I just want to
because
point out that I
Ed, then
I
Robin,
have
then
not
Paul.
agreed with Paul in 45 years.
I know, this is amazing.
But having said that, he started on the is of identity problem, I'll call it. And I think it is worth pointing out that it has multiple functions, essentially in the poetic world, but the poetic world is one we also live in. And so, I'm not going to forget my experience, it's not relevant, but I have heard it is what it is many times. And mostly it serves a poetic function, a phatic function in sometimes ending a conversation, and it's based on agreement.
Right.
And I could probably do, poems always work that way. While I was sitting there, I was thinking of a Ferlinghetti poem, whose name I can't remember anymore, the name of the poem, but it's about traveling up on upstate New York, and it's raining, it's fall, and it's a repeated line. The leaves are falling, falling, falling. The leaves are falling, falling, falling. It's not about the damn leaves, or it is, but it's also about windshield wipers falling, 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 falling. It's about so many things, rhythmically, all kinds of ways. And the fact is, that's the way we speak. So the is of identity is a very valid point of general semantics, but it has to be, it is not always the is of rational speech, not rational, it's all rational, but didactic speech, maybe. If you're talking about something that is, and you're telling something they are bad, that's a good example of a point. But there's a whole realm, and as a poet, Lance, you understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but leaves are falling is not an is of identity. That's again the to
My
be as a
point-
helping
My
word.
point there is not about is of identity, but it's about is in the phrase, which I think has interesting, wonderful meanings. It is what it is. It's an acknowledgement, it's a fatalistic acknowledgement that we have to put up with this, we have to accept this. And it's usually a
No, we
shared
don't.
thing, because it usually functions as an ending, a resolution to a discussion, maybe even a conflict. Now, there's probably a million other reasons that I can't come up with sitting here, but it just seems to be, I think that needs to be taken into account.
Well, I agree with you. I think the bonobo
God, now
monkeys,
it's
the
not me.
bonobo monkeys
Hasn't
would
happened
agree with you
before.
too. It leads to peaceful resolutions.
The bonobo monkeys would not understand what he just said.
Well, just to your point, Ed, I mean, I include here, and this is part of this discussion that gets into E prime, but there's a quote from Ernest Fenollosa's essay, "The Chinese Character is a Medium for Poetry," which was originally published in 1919 by Ezra Pound. So I'll just read this quote. "The moment we use the copula, meaning is, the moment we express subjective inclusions, poetry evaporates. The more concretely and vividly we express the interactions of things, the better the poetry. We need in poetry thousands of active words, each doing its utmost to show forth the motive and vital forces. We cannot exhibit the wealth of nature by mere summation, by the piling of sentences. Poetic thought works by suggestion, crowding maximum meaning into the single phrase, pregnant, charged, and luminous from within." Right? So, but I also point out that actually not using the verb to be in poetry is much easier than in prose. But we go back to, in media ecology now, in orality and literacy, Eric Havelock, and the way that the verb to be is used in Homeric diction, right? In the Iliad and the Odyssey, it is never used as the is of identity. And that comes with literacy, with the alphabet, and you get to the point where you get like Plato, like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and they're going, what is the good, right? You know, and this is kind of insanity in a way, because you're trying to, you know, deal with this, with something that is totally abstract, rather than grounding it in good action, good as an adjective, good action, good behavior. What is justice? You know, for Homer, there is, you know, just action, and that's what counts. It's the concrete that counts, that's real, and you get lost in these high-level abstractions that lead you nowhere. And that's, again, it's part of understanding general semantics, and it's not to say we should never use high-level abstractions, because they're important, but to always bring us back into the real world and real things going on with real people, and not get lost in this sort of like word salad of metaphysics that I know this offends a lot of people, but like, you know, people like that old Nazi Heidegger, you know, get into. I mean, it's just like, you know, from general semantics, it's sort of like blah, 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 just tossing words around rather than dealing with real concrete stuff that's going on in front of us.
Well, what about the
Thank you.
song
That
"We Are
actually
the World"?
That actually made the distinction I was reaching for and couldn't find.
What about the song "We Are the World"? By the way, tell us about why that's wrong. That's, you know, that's a classic example. It's an identity. I think, as Ed said, it's clearly poetry. No one thinks the "We Are the World" is literally true and encompasses every single person. But it's,
All right, well, that song was ridiculed because it was a bunch of Americans and, you know, and going, "We are the world." So yeah, it was a bad move. Yeah.
You think it was a bad letter?
Yeah.
There were some British people there too.
Yeah, so, well, Americans and Brits going, "We are the world." Okay.
Not everybody.
That, you know,
It was a
They weren't
culture.
saying they were. They were saying.
It was a culture.
Okay, wait, I had said Robin and then Paul, so Robin.
Okay, just two quick things. First, with regard to what you said about apostrophes, A.E. Hausman said, "There is life and death in a comma." And this is true. And secondarily, I took Neil Postman's class, Language and Human Behavior, and he told us this quote and talked about it for half an hour by Bertrand Russell. And I think it goes for everything you've been talking about tonight. What do you think of this, Lance? The things we say are all unsuccessful attempts to say something else. Bertrand Russell. From Neil Postman.
Absolutely. I mean, Bertrand Russell was a major influence, Russell and Whitehead, on Korzybski. And again, I mean, they were dealing with it philosophically. You know, Korzybski tried to distill these ideas like that down into something that regular folk could understand and apply in fruitful ways, and that could be applied in politics to prevent war, for example, among other things. So yeah.
Paul?
So it seemed to me that, you know, the general semantics warnings about the use of identity are relevant the more literate the context. But a real question, as we move into a post-literate situation, would you say that we use it more metaphorically so it's less dangerous?
Not necessary.
Well, I actually have a section in that piece about metaphor where I say that that's actually a good use of the verb to be, you know, and that when you say, like, my love is like a red, red rose, you know, that nobody really thinks of that as identity, you know, and so that eliminating the verb to be entirely would not work, because for one, we couldn't have metaphor then, for that reason. So yeah, also I point out that without the verb to be, we couldn't say that the map is not the territory and the word is not the thing. So is not requires is. So I think there are useful forms of it. I'm not sure if we're more metaphorical today than we were previously. I mean, that's an interesting point, Paul. Maybe you have to, like,
Not consciously so, but.
But yeah, I mean, you know, is an interesting point though about. I know that there's a question of metaphor versus metonym. Metonym is more where a part stands for the whole, or something associated. You know, where metaphor is something completely different. You know, metonym is like when you say, like, a hand referring to a person, or wheels referring to a car, or the crown referring to the king, and that, you know, the White House referring to the president or the administration. I think there are transitions from orality to literacy when we go to that. So maybe we're being more metaphorical today.
Or
You
just
might be right.
analogical, right? Just analogical versus metaphorical.
Yeah, well, metaphor is an analogy, right?
Right.
And so,
Without the like or else, right?
well, it's an interesting problem, because in a lot of ways we're more digital, right? But the more that we're visual, the more we're in a metaphorical realm.
Well, for
So,
most people, the digital is like, I mean, it's underlying, you know, architecture that they don't understand. They
Yeah.
just understand the interface.
But I like it, Paul, because actually in the if not A then E piece, and I actually suggest that, you know, it's something that I'm sure you're very familiar with, that, you know, that when we look at what Korzybski was getting at, it is very much in line with electronic culture and the shift away from literacy. So I think, yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay, yes.
And thus Trump.
Yeah, it is what it is. Always to me meant that people were at a loss for words to explain why something physical in nature or experience or event or something that you could point to, and saying it is what it is the only thing you can say, because the reality is meaningful in a dramatic way, and you have no words to express it, and so that's a bridge between semantics and systems, and Korzybski emerged as a philosopher and poet at the same time systems thinking was doing the same sort of thing, but in a different way.
He actually preceded systems theory.
Well, there were other systems thinkers that preceded systems thinking too, but it emerged, and there hasn't been much crosstalk between the systems thinking of language and the systems thinking of nature, and I see a lot of opportunities to do so. Do you see any relation between the systems that the reality is made of and the systems that language is made of?
Well, that's the idea of the map is not the territory. That is, nature, reality has certain characteristics. We do not have direct access to it. It has to be mediated through our nervous systems and then through language, but we can have better maps and worse maps, more accurate maps and less accurate maps, maps that help us to get where we're trying to go, and maps that lead us astray. Now, Korzybski came to this as he was an engineer, someone schooled in science, and with the idea that science has done a better job of mapping reality than anyone else, which is like we wouldn't, we have light, we have our phones, we have airplanes overhead, we have all the stuff we wouldn't have without that. So argument is let's find a way to generalize scientific method from the specialized approach that scientists take to everyday life.
Right, but the scientific approach of representing nature as scientific theory has led us to destroying a planet.
Well, that's not science. That's technology.
No, that's science.
But no,
it's science. But definitely, science.
Well,
mathematics has no flaws, and nature is full of variations of flaws of all kinds.
Right.
Science uses mathematics because you can extrapolate it to infinity without it changing form. But you can't do that with any natural system. And so that was missed somehow in philosophy, that when you push natural systems to the relationships limits, because systems are actually made of relationships between things.
Right.
But
that's all consistent with what we're talking about here, because for Korzybski, Einstein's was really key, and understanding relativity, which is that everything is in relation to something else. There's nothing can be completely isolated from its environment or from its interaction with other things. So, that's where one of his phrases was the organism as a whole in its environment. All of these things connected with hyphens, because the idea is to think in this holistic way. Again, and Gregory Bateson built on this. It was a big influence. Ludwig von Bertalanffy called it general systems theory after general semantics. So, they're all picking up on this idea. Maturana and Varela with autopoiesis. If you read the Tree of Knowledge, they don't acknowledge general semantics, but it's straight out of Korzybski. So, all of this was an attempt to create a new way of thinking for the revolutions that were brought with the 20th century. And again, that goes back to non-identity, because what does Einstein tell us? That every phenomenon is an event, right? What we think are things are actually happenings, things that are come into existence and going out of existence. And so, that kind of understanding of the dynamic nature of reality is what science brought us, right? And it is this reversal or this change from the mechanistic view of Newton and industrialism and all of that. And it's consistent with evolution and ecology and these new ways of looking at it. And what we're saying is that you need a new way of thinking a new kind of consciousness to go with that.
Right, and I guess
So
my
I don't see
question
what the problem is there.
is how do you relate to the territory? If you don't use a map, how do you relate to the territory?
You can't avoid you can't not use a map. There is you inevitably, I mean, unless you're unless you're unconscious, you have to have a
No,
map.
you're responsive. Living systems exist by being responsive,
Right.
and they don't make maps. They
Sure
just
do.
respond.
Of course, that's what the map is.
No, if they had an abstract mind, they would. Yes.
No,
of
no,
course.
no. You don't understand what's meant by map in this system, right? That
Well, map is an abstraction.
it's a metaphor,
The whole purpose
though.
of the
Well,
word is abstraction.
But don't tell, you shouldn't be telling me what is meant by map in general semantics,
Really,
right?
same.
Right? So, the map in general semantics is a metaphor for our meaning, the meaning we make out of reality. What is the meaning we make out of reality? In the simplest way, it is the response to a stimulus. That is the behavioral view, and we can go back to Pavlov, and this recent piece I did, for the Balvant-Perec Center, and also before that for the last AKML symposium, is going back to this point that it's grounded in behaviorism, that what the basic understanding, and just getting away from the book though, but is that meaning is, and this is what Christine Nystrom taught us. I should give credit, because for me it starts with Christine Nystrom, is that meaning is a response to a stimulus, and that's in Ogden and Richards, the meaning of meaning. That's in George Herbert Mead with symbolic interaction, and it's the idea that for the most primitive form of life, it is however they respond, that behavioral response, like moving towards light or away from light or absorbing a nutrient. I mean, that is the meaning. It is the behavior, but then for higher forms of life, it involves neural activity when you have a nervous system, and cognition, which is information processing, and ultimately when you get to, particularly to us, it involves all this conscious thought processes. But all of that is covered by the metaphor of the map.
Can I just ask a question about that?
Can I inject one little last thing? That the meaning in English of map is an abstraction of the territory. It's
Right.
not the territory.
Exactly.
And it's not your relationships with the territory. Your relationships with the territory are via some entirely different mechanism of attachment.
The map territory relationship is your relationship to reality.
That's too many.
Well, you can choose to like it or not like it.
It's just.
But that you
it's
don't.
very inconsistent.
There's nothing inconsistent about
To
it.
say the map is the territory and isn't the territory at the same time.
I never
is
said the
inconsistent.
map is not the territory.
You say, well, then how can the map be your relationship to the territory?
I said the relationship between the map and the territory is your relationship to your environment.
Well, it's not at all for most people. Most people behave spontaneously without any
And that's your map.
precognition. No, that's not a map. That's life.
You notice how we get.
behavior.
Are you
Yeah,
going
well,
to,
is this case in
Yeah, it's
point
okay. Can I just
about,
stop?
well, just case in point about the problem of is. It is not, right? This is exactly the problem, and this is why people wind up with problems in thinking, right?
Okay, let me just try to clarify this a little bit. And tell me why this is wrong, but maybe it's right, and if it's right, maybe we're all really agreeing about this. To me, the recognition that the map is not the territory, I'm using the word is again, but for
It's okay.
teaching
don't worry.
purpose, to me, that is just a specific example of a description of whatever is not the same as
The
that.
thing.
So if I say, there are lights in this room, that's a description, it's an abstraction. The reality is there are lights in this room, but obviously I can't get burned if there was any way I could touch, let's say, even a written version of that description. So I think what Korzybski was saying is, people sometimes get so caught up in descriptions or maps that they mistake it at their peril for the reality that it's describing. Is that right?
But sure, but it's not, when you say description, that implies verbal, but it's also our perception. So, it's the fact that you walk and you have an idea of what the ground is, and just the fact that we're not born perceiving, we learn how to perceive. It's another thing Chris taught us, well, Chris and Neil, but the whole process of sense perception, where we're taking in information, but that is not just like a passive process, but it's actively making sense of our environment, is map making. That is the map. And then we work off of, and again, Adalbert Ames, that was one of our...
That was the first lesson in media ecology.
Is that we create a set of assumptions about the world, and then we act on them.
Right.
And
that detaches you from the world.
Well, it always will never be the same as the world out there.
But
nothing that we're seeing, nothing that you're seeing
different.
right now is actually what's out there. It's the process of light landing on your retina, which is very sensitive and shoots electrochemical signals through the nerve cells, and somehow that combines in your brain to create some kind of image. It's not fiber optics, it's not a camera that's taking pictures of what's out there, right? That's the map.
Yeah,
Let me ask,
but-
did I
and
miss
So
artificial.
let's just stop, because this is like,
Am I
ridiculous.
missing Missy?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so you know what's fun, Lance?
Yeah.
Whenever I go back and read Neil's work, things that Chris wrote, and then I see, it's 40 years later since I first met those things. I can't remember if it was Chris or Neil who taught us the idea of physics envy, right? That the humanities folks, the historians that wanted to explore ideas, go ahead and boldly said them, but then there was always people who wanted to measure everything, right? Now I say all of this because when you read Amusing Ourselves to Death, just like 5 years ago, right? You went, oh my God, he was right about everything. Everybody measured it all, but he didn't care about measurement at all, right? So when I'm hearing you talk about, I know the I am bad versus, or I am a B student, I'm thinking about all of the work that's gone on recently about growth mindset and grit, and they're measuring everything, right? And they're measuring things. They should be reading general semantics. They're not, but they're actually proving our point. So what I want to know from you, as we close up our conversation and get you to sign our books, is what's the next thing to be proved from your book? What's the magical social science or scientific thing that somebody's going to prove 10 years from now that you've written about?
Well,
Yeah.
well, I don't know, that involves a degree of extrasensory perception that I don't, I'm not able to employ.
Well, what would you like us to have proved?
Metaphor here is nice curveball.
I don't know. I mean, I think that I like people to think more. I mean, it's not so much proving though. In the piece about changing the world, I mean, and I said I wasn't going to mention it, but I will. I mean, my conclusion is that there is these 3 E's, which also relate to the model that I try to build in the if not A then E, but where I'm playing a lot with A's and E's as a consequence. But that the 3 E's are experience, right? And it goes back to I talk about Steve Jobs and this idea that the success of Apple was about creating an experience, not just a gadget, but we need to create an experience that is compelling for folks, and that also has to lead us to think about an environment. To me that is so important, that what we need to do is create. And this is the thinking ecologically that comes from Neil and Chris in media ecology, but also it's there in Korzybski when he's talking about the organism as a whole in an environment, that we need to create an environment, that you don't just do things, but you have to create a good environment in which good things can happen. And that, it certainly can say one of the flaws with our current leadership is this idea to try to control everything, to try to dictate, where the proper course is to create a healthy, open environment in which everyone can flourish, right? And new things can happen, positive things can come out of it. And that the third piece of that, the third E, is event, right? It goes back to, we have to think about that everything is an event. So we just think environment, we tend to think of steady state and permanence. And it's so hard to get past that assumption of permanence. That's the problem with maps, is that they're always, like even our GPS can be out of date because things can change in it from one moment to another. And it's just this to remember that everything is ephemeral. As much as we think that things are, stay the way they are, everything is vanishing. Yeah, thanks. I was hoping somebody would close that door. I don't know about you, but there's so many times when I could have gone to see somebody, or could have met somebody, could have talked to somebody, and I just didn't. I'm too tired, or it's too hard, and then they're gone, right? It's funny, we were talking before this started, my old colleague at Fordham, Mayor Ribolo, and he was the fellow who was really active here at the Players, and he was the one who got me to know about the Players, inviting me to events here, which is where I decided to start with the New York Society originally to have events here. And when Mayor passed away, I was the only Fordham person, they had a memorial downstairs here for him. And one of the people, I was the only Fordham person who spoke, but one of the people who spoke was Alec Baldwin, right? Who Mayor had worked with when Baldwin was president of the Creative Coalition. Mayor was vice president and did all the work, And Baldwin said, that Mayor had, contacted him and called him up, and said, could we get together this summer? He says, I'm not well, and I'd like to see you. And Alec was, I'll try to, I'm kind of busy, blah, 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 right? And he never did. And then Mayor was gone. And it just said, it said to the crowd there, it's just a reminder not to do that, to remember that. And it is so hard for us to think about that. And it is also comforting, as dark as things look right now. And in all honesty, right now, I have never felt such shame about our country as I do right now. Never. The first time Trump was president, I was embarrassed, and I apologized to people from other places, but I feel shame now with what he's doing, downright shame. But it is, at that point, it is also a comfort to remember that everything changes, that we are talking about events that are happening, they're going into existence, they're going out of existence, and this too shall pass. And that's, what I
Lance, I
think,
think there are at least 3 experiments we can do tomorrow based on what you just told us, so thank you.
great.
So thank you. These books aren't going to sign themselves, so why don't we stop there and thank our
Okay, well, so they are for sale. Again, the proceeds go to the IGS. If you want to pay in cash, $10, or I actually can take a charge for, but with $12. Their list price $24, so that's half price.
If he signs it, it's 100.
Well, then you can see what you can get for them on eBay. So thanks.
Thank you.